righty. And we'll start off here talking about the spinal cord and all of its awesomeness. Okay, so we know that the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and that pretty much connects the brain to the rest of your body. So where we'll see it is we're going to see it just inferior, right below the brainstem, specifically the medulla oblongata. And it's going to travel down through our vertebral column in the space there called the vertebral canal. But what we're going to find out is that the vertebral column is much longer than the actual spinal cord itself. And so we'll talk about that. So there's 4 parts to the spinal cord: the cervical, the thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. We saw in the spine itself, in the vertebral column, there was 5 parts. We had the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. We don't see that here with the spinal cord. All right, our spinal cord will stop at L1. So by the time you get to L1, so you'll have this cord-like structure, and then it stops and it forms this little kind of pointy structure. And that pointy structure is called the conus medullaris. And from there, right, we'll have our nerve rootlets here will hang down. And there's many of them. And so anatomists describe those as a horse's tail, but they didn't call it a horse's tail. They called it the Cardiaquina. And that's what we're seeing. So at L1, the cord itself terminates, and then what's remaining are these spinal nerve roots that are just hanging down inferiorly. We call those the Cardiaquina. And when you're looking at the spinal cord, you'll notice 2 enlarged areas in the cord itself. In the superior area, it'll be up in the cervical region, and then the lumbar area, it'll be, or the inferior area, will be down in the lumbar region. And again, that's because, all right, both of those regions have to innervate the upper and lower extremities. I can't even see that there. Okay, so that just makes sense. That's why we'll see these enlarged areas there. Let's get those back in so everybody can see it. There we go. There we go. Okay, so consider that the explanation that we have our upper and lower extremities that we need to innervate. So those areas of the spine are going to contain a larger than normal number of neurons there. So here you can see our awesome drawing here. We'll go right to the top here. All right, couple things. Our spinal cord descends inferiorly off of the brainstem, inferior to the medulla oblongata, travels down through the vertebral canal, and it will end here at the L1 vertebral body there. And from that point on, all right, you'll see those spinal nerve roots just hanging down, and that's called the Cardiaquina. And then the actual tip there of the spinal cord is known as the conus medullaris. We'll see that up here in the cervical region and then down here in the lumbar region, we'll see a bulging going on, and that is going to be because of those extra neurons that are going to be supplying the upper and lower extremities there. So, a review for us in case you forgot. A nerve is a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system. A bundle of axons in the central nervous system is known as a tract, T-R-A-C-T. So our nerves are going to be wrapped with connective tissue. All right, we have the epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium. All right, the epineurium is the outermost. That's going to surround the entire nerve. And then the endoneurium is going to surround each individual axon, acts as insulation there. And the perineurium is going to be bundled around the fascicles, which are a group of axons. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And Similar to how we denoted the vertebral segments there, we use the letter, then with a number. We're going to do the same thing here with our spinal nerves. The letter is going to tell you what region of the spinal cord that spinal nerve came off of. And then obviously the number tells you out of how many total spinal nerves in that region, which one we're dealing with. So T1 would be the first spinal nerve that comes off of the spinal cord in the thoracic region of the spinal cord. Okay. So when we're looking at our spinal nerve, it's going to be helpful if we understand, and I know I've kind of touched on some of this information kind of haphazardly. Now we're going to kind of pull things together when we talk about the overall gross anatomy of the spinal nerve. So what we're going to see, all right, let me show you here. We have the structures, the rootlets, the posterior root, and the anterior root. And then we have our posterior root ganglia. So I like to show it in a picture here. It makes it a little bit easier. All right, a couple of our structures here. So here's our spinal nerve. That's where the anterior root and the posterior root come together and they fuse, right? And we have our spinal nerve, mixed nerve. Right? We have a bulge here in the posterior root, and that's our posterior root ganglion. And then you can see as we get closer to the spinal cord itself, all right, the posterior root now just kind of branches off into these smaller structures. And those are going to be called the posterior rootlets. Same here on the anterior portion. You've got the anterior root, and then you'll notice how it branches off into smaller structures, and those are the anterior rootlets. Right. Review. Anterior root contains motor axons only. Posterior root contains sensory axons only. Our spinal nerves are mixed nerves, and so they'll contain both sensory and motor neurons there. All right. So the rootlets immediately emerge or come off of the spinal cord itself, right? And these individual rootlets will form our roots. All right, so the posterior root is in the back portion of the spinal cord. The anterior root is going to be in the anterior portion. Sensory neurons only in the posterior root, motor neurons only in the anterior root. And then we'll see where the posterior and the anterior root come together. Then we get our spinal nerve. Okay, Cardiaquina, like I mentioned before, right, that is going to be where the spinal cord has ended, and we see the spinal nerves hanging down past the L1 vertebra, and those roots are called the Cardiaquina. And so those roots come from the lumbar, sacral, and the coccygeal regions of the spinal cord. All right. So I've talked about when we were dealing with the brain in chapter 13, we were talking about, after we went over all the neurological structures there, we wanted to talk about some of the support structures. So we saw how the meninges up in the brain there protected the brain and had some functions. Well, those same meninges are going to cover our spinal cord. And so they're going to offer protection and support to the spinal cord too. Along with that, we'll also have, right, the actual vertebral column, the bone there, offering quite a bit of protection and support. And then of course, right, our cerebral spinal fluid, we saw what it did for the brain. And so we're going to see how the cerebral spinal fluid is also going to help out with the spinal cord. So the vertebral column, the bone, that's the house to the spinal cord. It lives there. Spinal cord travels in the posterior portion of the vertebral column and the vertebral canal. At each level, all right, at each vertebral level, we're going to see a spinal nerve exit out of your spinal column. And the hole that it leaves through is the intervertebral foramen. So if you look here, here is an intervertebral foramen right here. And so that spinal nerve exits right out. You have an intervertebral foramen on each side there. All right, meninges. 3 layers. The innermost layer is the pia mater, that's the soft mother. The middle layer is the arachnoid mater, right? That's the spidery mother. And then the dura mater is the outer layer. That is going to be the hard mother. The innermost layer is going to attach to all the nooks and crannies of your spinal cord. And so it's going to be made up of those elastic and collagen fibers, okay, because it's tightly adhering. Now, there's a structure that you should be familiar with. It's called the denticulate ligaments there. And so they shoot off the side here of the spinal column here, of the spinal cord, excuse me, whoops, sorry, let me zoom in here. And it helps to stabilize, there they are, here's the denticulate ligament, right? It helps to stabilize and give the spine, right, lateral stability there, so it's not swinging around in that spinal column there. All right, see the vertebral column, we've only seen it as a space, but besides the spinal cord, you can see that we have other tissues in here. We've got some epidural adipose tissue, some fat, okay, and we want to help to insulate the spinal cord, but also protect it, give it some cushioning. Then we'll have our different meninges, and then of course our cerebral spinal fluid will be floating down here. We'll talk about that in a second. Also, what we'll see is the filum terminale, which is this structure that sits at the bottom of your spinal cord. So where your spinal cord terminates at the conus medullaris, there's this thin strand of pia mater, and it goes inferiorly off of the conus medullaris, and it goes all the way down to the anterior portion of the coccyx, your tailbone there, and it attaches to the coccyx, helps to anchor that bottom portion of the spinal cord. So again, it's not kind of banging around in there. Our next layer is the arachnoid mater, right? Recall the arachnoid mater, the spidery mother. This has, all right, the arachnoid trabeculae, those extensions that attach onto the pia mater. So create like the scaffolding in between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, and that space in between those two layers is called the subarachnoid space. And this is where we see our cerebral spinal fluid flowing. The outermost layer, the dura mater, right, is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. Now up in the cranium there, right, it was 2 layers. Here down the spinal cord, it is 1 layer. A big role is obviously to protect the spinal cord, but it also is going to help to stabilize the spinal cord. So we have 2 spaces, right, both outside the dura mater and then just deep to the dura mater. The subdural space is going to be between the middle layer, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater, and then our epidural space is going to be found in between the dura mater and the actual bone of the vertebrae. And in that area, that's where we're going to see most of our packing material, most of our adipose tissue, lots of blood vessels, right? We'll see some other connective tissue, like some areolar connective tissue, because you know, areolar connective tissue, loose connective tissue, is the packing material of the body here. So here you can see, we have the pia mater directly on the outside, it's this white kind of covering here of the spinal cord. And then it looks pink to me, right? That is the arachnoid mater. You can see some of the arachnoid trabeculae kind of extending from there. But in this space, that's where the cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow. That's the subarachnoid space. And then just on top of the arachnoid mater is our dura mater. So there's that potential space, that subdural space in between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. Outside of the dura mater, here's that epidural space. This is where we're going to find our blood vessels, some of our connective tissue, and our adipose tissue there. And if you notice here, the dura mater extends pretty far outside of the vertebral canal. It'll cover part of that spinal nerve as that spinal nerve is exiting out of the intervertebral foramen there. Then you can see we have our anterior root, posterior root here. all right, coming together and eventually forming that spinal nerve there. Okay, so that's a nice transverse cut, all right, of the vertebral column and the spinal cord. We're going to talk about now how you can see all these varying layers. Let me switch this up. All right, the outermost layer, that dura mater, you can see how far out it extends. The arachnoid mater doesn't extend all that far, and you can see, kind of see through it a little bit because it's much thinner. And then the pia mater, again, is directly adhering onto the spinal cord itself. Okay, so let's talk about, we talked about gray and white matter in the brain. And so I want to talk about the distribution of the gray and white matter in the spinal cord. In the brain, we saw pretty much the cerebral cortex, the outer portion of your brain is going to be gray matter, and then internal to that will be the white matter. In this scenario, we kind of flip-flop that. So you should know this already, what gray matter is. All right? It's primarily going to be cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. Included, obviously, are going to be the dendrites, the processes that come off the cell bodies. We don't really talk about the glial cells all that much, but they're included in there because they make up a good amount of the nervous tissue there. Right. So when we're looking here at the gray matter, think of it like an H, some people say a butterfly, in the center of the spinal cord. So there's different components. We have the back portion, or the top part of our H, that's going to be the posterior horns. And so that's where we're going to see our sensory neurons and the cell body of any interneurons located in the spinal cord. The anterior horn, this is important that you know this, are going to contain the somatic motor neurons. I mentioned that in lecture tonight. And then the lateral horns are going to contain the autonomic motor neurons. We're only going to see that, all right, in T1 through L2. Well, that looks interesting. I recognize that combination of letters and numbers. Well, that's the thoracolumbar, right, division. That's the sympathetic nervous system. And you're right, the lateral horns are where we're going to find, right, the cell bodies to the autonomic motor neurons for our thoracolumbar division there. So what connects the right side of the spinal cord to the left side of the spinal cord for the gray matter, we call that the gray commissure. And right in the center of that gray commissure is our central canal. And that central canal is lined by ependymal cells. And we'll see cerebral spinal fluid in that area there. Keep in mind, the gray commissure is unmyelinated tissue. In this case, we're dealing with unmyelinated axons that are going to decussate. They're going to cross from one side of the body to the other side of the body. All right, so that is our gray matter. Nuclei, there's another definition that should all be reviewed for you folks. All right, when we talk about nuclei and we're in the central nervous system because we're in the spinal cord, right, nuclei is a group of cell bodies. So here, in our gray matter, we're going to have sensory nuclei and motor nuclei. Our sensory nuclei are primarily going to be located in the posterior gray horn. And so we have two types: somatic sensory nuclei. Okay, somatic, consciously perceived sensory information. That means that information is coming from the skin and muscles and joints. I mean, we could cross this out and just say proprioceptors. Okay, so the somatic sensory nuclei receive signals from the skin and our proprioceptors, which are located in joints and muscles. The other type of sensory nuclei are the visceral. And the visceral sensory nuclei are going to receive that sensory information from the organs of your body, otherwise known as the viscera, and your blood vessels. More towards the front of the spinal cord here, in the gray matter, we're going to see the motor nuclei, which is going to be located in the anterior and lateral gray horns. So the anterior is going to contain the somatic motor nuclei, and they only control one type of tissue, and that's the skeletal muscle. The autonomic motor nuclei located in the lateral gray horn is going to be the remaining effector tissues. So cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands, which is a nice review for us because we just learned that. Okay, so if we're looking here at our picture, we'll zoom in here a little bit. Let's review the gray matter first. Okay, so here's our gray matter internal to the white matter. The back portion here is the posterior gray horn. And then in the front here, we have the anterior gray horn. And then this small bulge off to the side, that's the lateral gray horn. And then we have the surrounding white matter, which we'll get to. All right, we'll talk about the posterior funiculus and all that fun stuff in a second. Okay, so now let's talk about the nuclei. All right, this teal colored region, that's going to be the somatic sensory, all right, nuclei are going to be located here. So that information that you can consciously perceive is all going to arrive in this area here, all right, along with cell bodies of the inner neurons. All right, this darker, I don't know, it looks kind of blue there. That's where we're going to find our visceral sensory nuclei, right? Blood vessel sensory input and visceral sensory input is going to arrive there. Then we get to the anterior part of our spinal cord here. Way in the front, here is the anterior gray horn, and this is where we're going to see the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons for the somatic motor neuron. All right, that's going to be for skeletal muscles. And then here in the lateral horn, all right, that is going to be where we see the cell bodies for the autonomic motor neuron, and that is going to affect our visceral organ, well, not the visceral organs, but our smooth muscle, our cardiac muscle, and our glands. So let me just back out and come back in. So keep this in mind, you should really have a pretty decent understanding of this picture here. Keep it real simple. Sensory information enters into the back of the spinal cord. Motor information exits out the front, okay? So you should review, all right, where certain information, somatic sensory information comes in and where somatic motor output will exit, right? So if you learn that, I think that it'll be really helpful for that, for you to learn that. All right, white matter. White matter is going to be myelinated axons. And so these myelinated axons ascend up to the brain and they descend down from the brain. So you have ascending and descending tracts. We know that the ascending tracts carry sensory information. Descending tracts carry motor information. So let's look where we find, all right, the white matter. We have the posterior funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the anterior funiculus. So the posterior funiculus is going to be located right there between both of the posterior gray horns. And so again, it's going to carry sensory tracts, and those sensory tracts, we talked about this when we were talking about the medial lemniscal pathway. Those sensory tracts, there's two of them, right? We have the cuneatus fasciculi and the gracilis fasciculi, right? Depending on what part of the body the sensory input is coming from. So our posterior funiculus is located back here. That's going to be sensory information only. All right, our lateral funiculus obviously is going to be on the side of our H, our gray H in the center of our spinal cord, and it's going to have a mixture of both sensory and motor tracts. There's quite a few. I'm not going to go over all of those. We've gone over some of them in chapter 14. And then finally, our anterior funiculus is going to sit right in front of both the anterior gray horns there. And so there's an area there in which you'll have axons crossing from one side of the body to the other, and that's called the white commissure there. And again, we'll see both ascending and descending tracts there, or sensory and motor tracts in that area. So if you look here, you'll notice there's quite a few, and we've already gone over a few of these. All right, so just a quick review here. All right, there we go. Zoom out a little bit. All right, so here in our posterior funiculus here, we have our two sensory tracts. All right, the one that's closest to the middle or median portion here, that's going to be the fasciculus gracilis. Remember, that carries that vibration information, that touch information, proprioceptive information from your lower extremity, lower half of your body up towards, all right, your brain. So that's going to be located here. And then we have the fasciculus cuneatus, and that's going to carry that same information, but from the upper extremities in the upper half of your body. On the lateral portion here, this is going to be the posterior funiculus. Again, we got various tracts here. Remember our posterior and anterior spinal cerebellar tracts, our lateral and anterior spinal thalamic tracts. That's going to be for some our motor control, or not motor control. I'm on the wrong spot. Where are we? There we go. There's the lateral cortical spinal for our motor control there, and then the anterior cortical spinal is up here. All right, so that will be motor control. But my point being is, right, in the lateral anterior portion, you're going to have sensory and motor all throughout. All back here is going to be sensory only. All right, couple characteristics that you may notice here when we're talking about the spinal cord, when we do transverse cuts through them. Right, you'll notice here in the spinal cord in the cervical area, it's quite a large area here. When we get down into the thoracic area, it starts to shrink down a little bit, more so when we get down in the lumbar. In proportion, a lot more gray matter than there is white matter. And then when we get way down into the sacral region, just before the spinal cord terminates at the conus medullaris, you'll notice very little white matter in comparison to the gray matter there. So you can see here on our drawing, there's our cardiaquina. So again, we're terminating our cord there at L1. All right, I want to get into how the spinal nerves branch out once they leave the spinal cord. Because once we get out to the spinal cord, there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen to these spinal nerves. I wish it was just as simple as spinal nerve comes out and it goes to a structure and it innervates the structure. No. So what happens is when the spinal cord, when the spinal nerve exits the vertebral column through the intervertebral foramen, it splits. And the first branch goes backwards. That's the posterior or dorsal ramus. It's a very small branch. And this is going to innervate the deep muscles of the back and the skin that's on your back. Now, once that happens, all right, then the remaining part of the spinal nerve is known as the anterior or ventral ramus. That's going to be the larger of the two. And here's where stuff starts to get crazy. All right, this structure will branch multiple times. It depends on where we're located. If we're near where the extremities are, you'll see several branches coming out. And so it really depends on where we are in the spinal cord here. So the anterior ramus, we'll see if we're close in the cervical region, it is going to innervate the upper extremity. If we're down in the lumbar region, the anterior ramus is going to innervate the lower extremity. Also, we'll see how it's going to innervate the anterior and lateral portion of your trunk. That includes the thoracic region, the abdominal region, and the pelvic region. All of those, but that's just for the sides and the front. Because remember, we already got the back taken care of over here. So the anterior ramus will cover the remaining parts, all right, of your trunk, and that's the anterior and lateral portions there, plus your limbs. That covers pretty much everything. And so we'll see how these anterior rami, when they have these branches, it will form these structures in which we call plexuses, in which they'll just kind of intermingle with one another. We talked about this next part here in lecture tonight, the rami communicantes, the on and off ramp for our sympathetic trunk. So we have our gray rami communicantes and our white rami communicantes. And basically, they're how we connect the spinal nerve to the sympathetic trunk. And we already know that that sympathetic trunk is going to run parallel to our vertebral column. So we kind of zoom in here. You can see, all right, here's our spinal nerve. It's exited out of the intervertebral foramen, and we have this first branch, and it goes up into the muscles of the back and the skin on the back. So at that point, then that remaining part of the spinal nerve becomes, right, the anterior ramus. And so it'll go on to innervate the anterior portion of your trunk, the lateral portion of your trunk, and then the upper and lower extremities there. Right, we'll also see off of the anterior portion of the spinal nerve, you'll have these small branches that will connect to our sympathetic trunk. And so those are our on and off ramps. Remember, our white rami communicantes carries those preganglionic axons, all right, they're the entrance ramp to the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Then the gray rami communicantes is going to be the exit ramp. That's going to carry the postganglionic axons, all right, from the sympathetic trunk back into the spinal nerve or somewhere else, okay? And we'll learn about that stuff in lecture. Quick review here of the dermatomes, real fast. Spinal nerves carry sensory input. And the dermatomes are going to be an area of skin that's innervated by one single spinal nerve. So we made this awesome map. It should look familiar to you. Right now, you might be able to understand a little bit better when we look up here on the face. Remember, when we were talking about cranial nerve number 5, trigeminal, it's 3 divisions there, the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular, how it is going to innervate the face for sensory input. Okay, so touch, sensations, whatever, right, will come and travel on the trigeminal nerve. Whereas everywhere else, here on the rest of you, right, from your top of your head all the way down to the bottom of your feet, all those other areas of your skin are going to be innervated by your spinal nerves. And so we've mapped it out. And so certain areas of your body, all right, are going to be specific for that one spinal nerve. And I mentioned the example of the T10 dermatome, the skin around, all right, your belly button, T4, the skin around your nipple line there, T7. So again, this is important because if someone comes in complaining of certain symptoms, right, and if we're suspecting that there could be a reason for it related to the nervous system, then we can use our dermatome map and see, all right, well, if this person is experiencing, numbness on the outside of their leg, then and they sustained an injury to their back, right? Maybe they injured their spinal nerve and they're getting the numbness from that. All right, I'm going to stop here and with this part. We'll finish up the spinal cord next class, but let's do some labeling here. And then we'll get into what nerve plexuses are and all that other fun stuff. So if you do have your atlas out, please get it handy, make it ready. Okay, so what we're doing is we're going to look at a longitudinal view here of your vertebral column and the spinal cord. So here you can see, I zoom in a little bit, that's this whole structure. And this black line that you can see down the center of our spinal cord, that's the central canal. That black hole, or not hole, that black line, that dark line is representing where cerebral spinal fluid will flow in addition to the subarachnoid space. Okay, so that's the spinal cord. Then where the spinal cord terminates, right down here, right, that's the conus medullaris. You should know the level that it terminates at L1. And that's important because for any of you that have ever had a spinal tap, where they've had to go in and collect some cerebral spinal fluid because maybe they're suspecting that you might have meningitis. So we need to, I'd rather have someone stick a needle in my vertebral column than in my skull. So we're going to go and drain out some of that cerebral spinal fluid. So we've got to pass that needle, right, through your skin, in between your vertebrae, right, and then through the dura mater, through the arachnoid mater, and right into the subarachnoid space. And then we have to collect a sample while trying not to spill any of it, because if you've ever had a spinal tap or an epidural, sometimes with an epidural, I had a good friend of mine, she had an epidural, and she was leaking cerebral spinal fluid. And she wasn't sure about it until she was complaining of god-awful headaches. And so if your cerebral spinal fluid volume is low, one of the symptoms is going to be horrible, horrible headaches. So there's the conus medullaris. Then we're going to move up here into the cervical spine, up in the neck here. And you'll see, right, where these nerves, the anterior rami, are exiting out of the neck. Right, you're going to see where they make these interconnections here. We're going to talk about plexus next class. But up here in the neck, we call that the cervical plexus. You can see it a little bit better on this side. I don't know why the arrow is pointing there, but you can see it much better. Right? So you have the cervical plexus. Then one of the nerves that comes off the cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. You should know what this nerve does. It's going to innervate your diaphragm. You know, the muscle that helps you breathe. So the phrenic nerve, right, is going to be the nerve that helps to contract that muscle during inspiration. Here you can see the brachial plexus. You can see it much better over on the right side here. The brachial plexus is going to be that grouping of nerves that are going to innervate your upper extremity. Obviously, brachial meaning arm, so the brachial plexus there. Then as we get into the thoracic region, you'll notice this nerve that comes off and it sits underneath the rib. And that is called the intercostal nerve. The intercostal nerve is another name for the anterior ramus. Right, so we've given off our posterior ramus. And then at that point on, the anterior ramus and the thoracic spine, they're just going to follow inferiorly right underneath each rib. And usually there's a blood vessel that will accompany it, but we can't see it in this model here. So if there's ever a time in which you have to stick a needle into somebody's thorax, for example, maybe they have a pneumothorax where they're bleeding into their pleural cavity and one of their lungs has collapsed and you need to reinflate that lung. So you got to stick a needle into that thoracic cavity. Well, what you're going to do is you're always going to take the needle and stick it through, all right, superiorly above a rib. Real simple. Palpate out a rib, find the top part of that rib, and then stick the needle in just above that rib. All right, this model doesn't show it as well. Well, you can kind of see it over here off to the side. All right, but further out, you'll notice that the intercostal nerve will sit closer to the inferior portion of the rib. So that's why you would stick the needle on the top portion of the rib, because you'd be further away from the intercostal nerve. And there's blood vessels there too. All right, so that's the intercostal nerve. Okay, down here now in the lumbar portion, right, you have the lumbar plexus. And so the lumbar plexus comes from, all right, the lumbar roots here in our cardiaquina. So it's grouping here of nerves. That's the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus forms the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve is going to innervate, all right, the muscles on the anterior portion of your thigh, the quadriceps there. We'll talk more about this in next class. I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, so this big nerve here, that's the femoral nerve. Then way down here, close to the sacrum and coccyx, is the sacral plexus. All right, the sacral plexus contributes significantly to the largest, longest nerve in your body, and that's the sciatic nerve. All right, the sciatic nerve, longest and biggest nerve of your body, sciatic nerve. And here you can see the Cardiaquina. This is after the spinal cord has terminated and you have your spinal nerve roots hanging down here. And you'll notice right here in the middle, right, this structure looks like a nerve, but it's not. That is not. That is connective tissue. That is the filum terminale. Remember that strand of pia mater that I was telling you about? It attaches to the inferior portion of your spinal, the spinal cord, and it will then attach the spinal cord to the coccyx there. That's the filum terminale. All right, going back up to the cervical spine, we talked about this in the lecture today about our cervical ganglia. Right, that is going to be those structures that are going to allow the post-ganglionic neurons to go and innervate various viscera in your head, your neck, and your thoracic cavity. So the largest cervical ganglia is the superior cervical ganglia. Here's the middle cervical ganglia, and then our inferior cervical ganglia. And you can kind of see down in here, all right, the sympathetic trunk. I got a better picture for that. There's the sympathetic trunk. So the sympathetic trunk or the sympathetic chain is where the arrows are pointing to that it's yellow. I know this arrow is pointing to this pink structure. That pink structure is the sympathetic ganglia. All right, and that's it for the longitudinal view. So that's about 17 structures that you should look over